Hi everyone. Before you start, I would like to ask you to support me with your like and subscribe. Enjoy listening. Funeral homes aren't exactly what you think they are. The reality is that if you are reading this, then likely it's too late already. The cat's out of the bag and the human population of our entire planet is in a tailspin over the truth I've decided to share. But just in case we survive tonight, I still feel it's time the truth is found out before this potential storm happens again. First, let me introduce myself. My name is Frederick Malvin, and I come from a long line of funeral home directors in Wisconsin. In fact, the very building I still preside over was constructed by my great-grandfather in 1922. If you think about it, you'll often notice that funeral homes are most often a family business. Let me assure you that this is in no way a coincidence, or simply because the kids could never launch off from the nest. The truth is far more grave than that. Pun sort of intended. Let me explain. If you've read any archaeological magazines or online articles, you've likely seen some of the strange graves that have been discovered with steel cages and locks on them. Or perhaps you've seen exhumed 16th century bodies with rocks crammed into their jaws in a manner that leaves them useless if one were to suppose the being were still living. The reality is that these acts were perpetrated by those in my vocation, and for good reason. You see, most people believe that the job of those who prepare the bodies of the deceased is to simply pump them full of a formaldehyde substitute and sell the families an overpriced casket. Yes, that is generally the case on a day-to-day basis. But our true purpose dates back 1,000s of years. Our true calling is to protect the living from the aftermath of what death does to some beings when they pass. Those cages I mentioned earlier? They were legitimately intended to keep the dead right where they were in case the unrefined procedures that needed to take place weren't performed correctly, as was the large stones in the jaws. They say there is a little truth in all fairy tales, and I'm here to tell you that's an absolute certainty. Vampires, zombies, werewolves, and even skinwalkers are all very real. Please stick with me here as I explain as quickly as I can. These beings once walked in large numbers among the general population. In fact, many of history's darkest eras were a product of these beings wreaking havoc on certain societies. There's many theories about their origination, but as professional all I know is that the numbers and the bloodlines of these beings have diminished as time has passed over the centuries. Many people walking around today would never know it, but they just might be the great-grandson of a bloodsucker that terrorized London in the 30s. Or their uncle might have been responsible for the increase in bear attacks in northern states decades ago. While these beings do still fully exist and terrorize our world, their frequency and power has diminished greatly today. But unfortunately, their blood is powerful and oftentimes lies dormant in your average person, and that's where I and others of my profession come into play. We are the guards of the grave, a society whose sole purpose is to oversee and monitor the decomposition of every human that passes. Because sometimes those strong genetics break through in the process of death, and the being becomes fully converted towards that faint strain. In other words, vampires especially are a very real threat to our society, and my job is to guarantee a stake to the heart, or a decapitation at the first sign of the bloodline attempting to resurface in a past individual. You ever noticed a large upswing in cremations? That's by no mistake. The reality is that we've been experiencing a larger volume of these outbreaks after death, so much so to the point that a cremation eliminates a lot of sleepless nights and a low staffing that simply can't monitor all of the corpses as they settle. There was a time when our secret society had a universal record system that traced and identified the family lines that possessed these dormant genes. But the newest outbreak has defied even our records. We are now finding ourselves chasing werewolves down Main Street in the middle of the night with tungsten bullets. The silver thing is a facade, it's all about the hardness of the alloy. Because Farmer Joe, who never had a trace in his bloodline, escaped his casket before his visitation the next morning. Last week I took a shovel to the back of the head of Mrs. Greer, who had my cousin cornered in the embalming room and was attempting to mindlessly devour him. We cannot explain this upswing. Some suspect that something in our atmosphere, or in the food we eat, or even in the prescribed medicines we take is mutating or even adding these genetic markers to our DNA. Others suspect it's more likely that most all of these genes might truly be possessed in all humans, and these environmental factors are simply setting them off. All I know is that thousands of years of research and practice has been found useless in the last few years as everything has been defying the odds. Another factor is the timeline. Ever notice that when great diseases or wars affect our world, that oftentimes you'll see great care taken in the mass gathering of the dead? This is because we often have 72 to 96 hours before we even see the effects of these awakenings. But in the last year alone we've witnessed the undead rise within 24 and even 12 hours after death. To put it truthfully, we are all exhausted, understaffed, and fearful that our world will soon see another era of darkness if these beings rise amidst the populace again. This brings us to the last 2 days. On Friday evening, a young lady who had passed from an unfortunate wreck was brought in. Her ancestry showed nothing in our records, and we had experienced a high-volume decease this past week. So the special area we keep the suspected undead was completely filled, so we places her in the general cool storage area. I was in the middle of cremating a suspected this vampire this evening, Saturday, when our in-house alarm system sounded. I sealed the chamber, grabbed my 10mm pistol and ran towards the shouts of my cousin Tim yet again. Except this time, I didn't make it in time, and what I discovered defied everything I thought I knew. The young girl was crouched over what remained of my cousin and had half transformed into a canine-like creature, only she was still standing on 2 feet, and as she turned to look at me she revealed the largest fangs I've ever seen. She was a hybrid. I immediately fired shots and felt that they had all found their mark, but they barely seemed to faze her as I retreated towards the steel doors to the storage area and initiated the lockdown system we had in place. I contacted my 2 remaining family members in the business and saw to it that the rest of the building was clear. That's when I heard more noises coming from that separate area we kept the more certain genetically marked deceased. Like I said, we had an influx of deaths in our small town this week, and although I hadn't allowed one body to be unattended for more than 48 hours, as soon as I arrived in our security/panic room, live footage revealed that 3 of the 5 remaining had awoken already. 2 appeared to your average flesh eaters, but the 3rd was also some type of hybrid flesh eater who also possessed fangs. I watched in horror as they fed on the other 2 corpses, with the fang being taking a dominant stance among them and exhibiting a strength like I had never witnessed in these beings as it began ripping door after door off of the storage drawers. That's when I decided to alert the central agency of what was happening here and call for backup. It took several minutes before I finally received an answer from a nearby town guard who themselves had just battled 4 beings and was currently chasing another hybrid he claimed could fly through a rural cornfield. Within minutes after that, it became apparent on the central communication forum that countless funeral homes were under siege and over their heads. I decided the only thing left for me to do was to completely lock down the entire facility and let me father and uncle, the other 2 employees, know that they needed to look for help anywhere they could while I dealt with the inside. I still confident that I could contain the outbreak within the facility if I had enough time to strategize and pick my opportunities to dispatch these beings. All those ideas went out the door 5 minutes ago when I saw a figure approach the door in the general storage area in the form of a bear before instantly transforming back into a humanoid. There stood my cousin Tim, already awakened, and he was punching in the door code. A couple minutes later the special storage code was entered and the door locks released. And now as I write, the doors to my panic room are being rammed over and over by several creatures I suspect. I don't believe the locks will hold much longer. Run while you can. The next story. The other me. I was 5 years old when this happened. It was a warm summer night. I was woken up in the middle of the night by a loud thud. I sat up in bed and looked around my room. It was dark except for the bit of moonlight shining through my window. Nothing in my room looked out of place or anything. Assuming that I must have imagined the noise, I lay back down and tried to go back to sleep. That was when another noise came. It sounded like footsteps. Someone was walking through the hallway. It didn't bother me that much at first. I just assumed it was one of my parents, probably going to use the bathroom. Then the footsteps stopped. There was only silence for a moment. The silence was then broken by soft and quiet laughter. Someone was standing in the hallway just laughing. I sat up in bed again. I was perplexed. Who could be laughing in the hallway at this hour? I started getting nervous. I wondered who it was. I first wondered if it could have been either my mom or dad. My dad was always such a prankster. He always played jokes on me and my mother. He liked to give us a scare. But I wasn't sure it was my dad laughing in the hallway. It was much too strange of a joke even for him, and my dad always made sure to get up early for work, so he wasn't likely to pull a prank late at night. The laughter continued for a little bit. It was starting to get unnerving. I then mustered up the courage to get out of bed and to check it out. My young mind at the time must have naively thought that perhaps my dad wasn't going to work that day, and that he must have thought that it was the perfect time to scare me like this. So I walked to the door, planning to put a stop on this joke. My heart started beating a bit faster as I got closer to the door. I couldn't help but feel like something was off, but nevertheless I went on. I put my hand on the knob. When I turned it, I heard the laughter stop. I will always wonder if my life would be different had I not investigated the noise. I may be alive and well right now, but my mind will always be plagued by what I saw that night. I opened the door. There was someone standing in the hallway, staring at me. That someone was me. Or at least something that had taken my form. It was like staring into a mirror. I saw myself, standing there in the hallway. It wore the same blue striped pajamas I had. It had the same black and curly hair that I did. It had the same brown eyes that I did. It shared the olive-colored skin that I had. It looked almost exactly like me. But even as a young child, I knew there was something deeply wrong about it. Its face was completely devoid of any human emotion. It just stared at me with a cold and piercing gaze. My heart sank into my stomach. I stared at, feeling deeply terrified. I was paralyzed. We just stayed in those positions, having a kind of staring contest that felt as if it went on for an eternity. That was when its eyes suddenly started glowing red. I stared and watched as its skin started turning gray. Suddenly it started sprinting towards me. I screamed and slammed the door shut. I locked it as tight as I could. The thing slammed into the door with a loud thud. I screamed as loud as I could, desperately calling out for my parents. After what felt like forever, I heard a knock on the door. I heard my parents calling my name. They sounded terrified. I quickly opened the door and threw myself into my dad's arms. I told them that a monster almost got me. I sobbed as I told them what happened. They didn't believe me, of course. My dad just rocked me in his arms and told me that it was just a bad dream. I went to sleep in their room that night. I didn't want to be left alone. I told them what happened again in the morning when I was calmer. They still didn't believe me, and they tried reassuring me that it was just a nightmare. That explanation never sat right with me, and it still doesn't. Even then I knew for a fact that what I saw was real. I can't explain what it was or why it looked like me, but I know it was real. The odd thing was that there was never another incident like that again. I suppose you think I'm lucky, but I wouldn't be so sure. That experience haunts me to this day. Anytime I look at my reflection, I swear that for a split second I see my reflection change. For a split second I see myself with those red eyes and the gray skin. I hope that someone reading this has had the same experience that I had. It would help me not feel like a lunatic. And I hope someone might be able to give me a possible explanation for this. If you have any possible explanation, then please share it with me. It might help me get over this thing. The next story. The itch. It all started with a crack. It always starts with a crack. A minor imperfection that catches your attention during those brief moments on autopilot. For me, it happened while I was putting away laundry. I was going through the house. Upstairs to downstairs, kitchen to bedroom to bathroom to basement with folded clothes and towels in hand. That's when I noticed it. At first, I thought it was a trick of the light. Shadows messing with my vision. I continued towards the stairs but stopped short, curious for an answer. It's that feeling, you know. The one when something is off. Lying in bed at night, trying to remember if you locked all the doors or turned off the stove burners. Sitting in your car after work, wondering who you forgot to call. A word you just can't place. A memory you have the faintest recollection of. An itch needing to be scratched. So, I turned around and retreated down the hall. At the end, there's a light switch and mirror. Old antique thing my wife inherited from her grandfather, or maybe a distant cousin. Hard to say. Just something to fill the space. To make our house look a little less empty. The space between the mirror and the light switch had a piece of chipped paint. A small fleck of plaster had somehow come undone. Nothing crazy, I know. Happens all the time, especially in a house as old as ours. But it bugged me. I tried to laugh it off. Wave it away and return to my chores before my wife got home, but I couldn't forget about it. I walked 2 or 3 steps, and I could just feel the back of my head burning. An itch needing to be scratched. So, I went back to the wall and placed my fingernail against the jagged edge of chipped paint. Gently, I flexed my finger up and down, rubbing at the rim, slowly peeling it away. But you know how these things go. Little by little, I started picking and pulling and prizing the paint away from the wall. A tedious task that I made faster with a flat-edged pizza cutter from the kitchen. I'm not much of a handyman, to my wife's chagrin, and I quickly realized I'd picked the wrong tool for the job. I went back to the kitchen and exchanged my pizza cutter for a knife. The process picked up some. I was peeling away entire strips of eggshell white paint. The more I peeled, the more jagged edges I found. The more I cut away, the more bubbles formed in the paint. I came to the conclusion that I would just have to do away with it all and repaint the wall later on the weekend. But the tedious process was killing me. Figuratively speaking, in the basement, with all the tools I'd amassed over the years from friends and family, I found a metal scraper. I went back upstairs and dug in until most of the back wall was without paint. There was a great deal of satisfaction there, I must admit. But as soon as I put my scraper down, I realized that there was a small crack in the drywall beneath. Same place as before, directly centered between the mirror and light switch. I thought about filling it with plaster or glue, or hell, maybe even enough latex paint would fill the gaps. But the very idea of that made my skin crawl. It wasn't right. It seemed insufficient, indecent, distasteful. No, it too had to be done away with. Backtracking downstairs, I went into my wife's studio and retrieved a small chisel from one of the dresser drawers. Like Andy Dufresne, I started etching and carving and digging my way through. Small chunks of plaster fell to the floor. Pockets of dust wafted with every stab. Every incision. My eyes were starting to sting, but I couldn't pull myself away from my work long enough to grab a pair of goggles. I just kept chiseling, squinting against the debris. Much like before, my patience got the best of me. I couldn't stand how tedious it was, the amount of time it required. From under the kitchen sink, I grabbed a hammer. The drywall crumbled and collapsed with a number of swings. This too was, in its own way, satisfying. But still, a few pieces remained nailed to the studs. I ripped them off and tossed them aside. Stepping back, I admired my work. I could see the internal wires and pipes, the insulation in between each stud. Could smell the musty dew that reminded me of my father's truck. He was a farmer, never had time to clean his truck, and within a few years, it was less of a truck and more of an ecosystem for pests. Mice especially, you could always hear them rattling around in between the metal panels whenever Dad got the engine going over 45. Squeaking in panic as their entire world shook apart. My satisfaction from a job well done was short-lived. When my wife came home, well, to put it simply, she wasn't happy. We had a very long discussion about my actions. There were accusations of being drunk or high or having lost my mind. I knew without a shadow of a doubt that at least two of those were not plausible possibilities. I only drink on the weekends. And I've never done any drugs other than smoking some weed back in college. My mind, my sanity to put it more appropriately, was a questionable matter. One that, realistically, I could not make a determination about without expressing some sort of noticeable bias. In the end, my wife was willing to chalk up the situation to a heat of the moment kind of thing. Impulsive thinking. Irrational behavior that occurs at odd intervals. A problem plenty of people experience on a daily basis. To put it in simpler terms, a dumbass being a jackass. She helped me sweep up the mess and take out the garbage. I called a local carpenter and booked a time for them to come out and fix the wall. My wife made dinner while I showered. We ate in silence, her disbelief somewhere between concerned and amused. After, I washed dishes while she dried. Regular night in spite of what had happened. After that, we went downstairs and sat on the couch to watch TV. But if I'm to be honest, I couldn't focus on any of the shows. Couldn't tell you what we talked about, or if we even talked at all. I was too busy thinking about the chipped paint, the crack in the drywall, the grooves in the floorboards and the spaces in between. About the indents of our textured ceiling. A tacky popcorn look of jagged ridges and bumps. I kept thinking about the small squeak of the second step on the stairs. The hollow moan of the draft in the bedroom. The sound of the mice in my father's truck, rattling against the loose panels. But I couldn't tell my wife about it. At least, not in a way that would make sense. Honestly, I was getting worked up. I could literally feel my skin crawling about it. As if there were maggots in the narrow space between bone and flesh, interspersed with my muscles and tissue. Worms wriggling beneath the surface. I snapped out of my fit when my wife turned off the TV and asked if I was ready for bed. I almost laughed because how the hell was I supposed to go to bed? This wasn't the kind of issue where you just count sheep or clear your mind or listen to rain sounds on YouTube. It felt permanent detrimental. But I had no plausible excuses, no rational explanations. So, I nodded my head and followed her upstairs. For about an hour or so, I lay in bed beside my wife, listening to her snore. Feeling the gentle rhythmic motion of her chest raising and lowering with every breath. Occasionally, the heat kicked on to help dispel the silence. But still, I could hear it. I could hear the quiet, the soft buzz of nothing in my ears. That flurry of emptiness like a light snowfall in the dark of night. Sighing, I climbed out of bed and stepped into the hall. To resist the urge to look at the wall was perhaps the hardest thing in my entire life. I was a child trying not to admit their mistake. Hoping that if maybe I ignored it long enough, it would suddenly disappear. I walked into the bathroom and closed the door behind me. I used the toilet, washed my hands thoroughly, but it still felt like there was some residue on them. So I washed them again, applying an extra lather of soap. Then, I just stared at myself in the mirror. I was almost afraid to go back out into the hall because I knew that if I glimpsed the wall, I wouldn't be able to walk away again. Wouldn't be able to ignore it. I was just biding my time, trying to build up a tolerance of sorts, psyching myself up for possibly the most mundane battle in existence. Just as I was about to leave, I noticed something in my reflection. A small dot on my forehead. At first, I thought it was a mosquito bite or a spider bite, but as I leaned in closer to inspect, I recognized it as a pimple. Hadn't seen many of those since my college days. Let me tell you, it was not a sight I missed. I positioned my index fingers, one on either side, and pushed them together. A small spot of white pus came slithering out, and I wiped it onto a piece of tissue paper, tossing it into the bin. But for some reason, I wasn't convinced I'd gotten it all. Pimples always had a way of producing more fluid, so I repeated the process, putting a finger on opposite sides and squeezing. More pus came, followed by a yellowish transparent fluid. I applied more pressure until it hurt. This time, a small dot of blood came out instead. Finally, I thought with a hint of relief. I turned on the tap, wetted my fingers, and wiped the blood away. Then, I opened the medicine cabinet and grabbed a small bandage. Peeling away the disposable paper, I glanced into the mirror again. Instantly, my eyes went to that small bump on my forehead. Flushed red with blood beneath the skin. Somehow bigger than before. Swollen by my interference. Ugly little thing. Just ignore it, I told myself. But it was there. That gnawing at the back of my mind. Unfinished business. An itch needing to be scratched. My mother used to tell me never to pop my pimples or pick at my scars. She would have been disappointed then because that's exactly what I did. I started picking at it with my fingernails, digging a small gouge in my forehead. But it wasn't enough. My tools were insufficient. I grabbed a pair of tweezers from the cabinet and pushed the metal tips beneath the skin, scraping away the stringy bits underneath. The remnants of pus and hair and oil and blood and all that built up grime. When my patience had run thin, I snuck downstairs into the garage for a piece of sandpaper. I rubbed the skin raw, ignored the pain that ensued. Because more than that stinging sensation was an overwhelming dissatisfaction. A possessive feeling that slowly consumed me whole. But even it was paltry in comparison to the itch at the back of my mind. In the end, when my piece of sandpaper was worn dull, I returned upstairs and grabbed the cheese grater from the kitchen. Then I locked myself in the bathroom. The pimple had become a vulgar mess of blood and raw skin. A hole in my flesh about the diameter of a golf ball. Putting the cheese grater to my forehead, I took a deep breath and exhaled. The itch needed to be scratched. And while I was cognizant of my actions, of the irrationality behind them, I just couldn't stop myself. Couldn't help myself from continuing this little conquest. My wife started knocking on the door, and when I didn't respond, she began pounding her fists against the wood, rattling the door in its frame, making the hinges jiggle and squeal. Sort of like those mice in my father's truck. She called my name over and over. I had no words, no answers, no explanations. There was just the sound of the cheese grater scraping against my skull, tearing away the skin in an attempt to unravel what lay beneath. It's a dangerous thing, focusing on the imperfections in life. To think about an itch. Once you start thinking about it, once you realize its presence, it just doesn't want to go away. And any mention of it has this neurological reaction, this incessant urge to scratch. But I intend to get rid of my itch, and I won't stop scratching until it's gone. The next story? The death app. 12 years ago, I bludgeoned my sister with a vase. It was the first time I killed someone in a fit of rage, and the only time I did so. I learned two things that day. First, that my parents never gave a damn about me or my sister, and second, that it would be the last time I killed someone out of rage. Why? Because from that day forward, the reason I killed people changed. No longer did I kill due to my short temper, I killed to instill fear. I wanted those around me to live in constant terror, wondering if they would be next on my hit list. I killed for fun. I was never going to be caught. Who would suspect a policeman of being a serial killer? Ever since the bodies started showing up, strangled, butchered, sometimes even shot, the Digital Investigation Unit has been combing the dark web for any clue the killer might have left behind. Too bad for them. They didn't realize all the weapons I used came from my old man's shed. No deals, no digital footprints. It was a crazy life I led. By day, I was a cop protecting others. By night, I was a killer hurting them. It was the 9th of November, the day Simeon, the leader of the Digital Investigation Unit, DIU, and the most respected member of the team, announced his resignation, citing personal issues. Those issues also prompted him to move all the way to the other side of Philadelphia. Naturally, questions arose about these so-called personal issues, but Simeon remained tight-lipped. The cops weren't stupid. They had already considered the possibility that Simeon might be the killer they were chasing and conducted a preliminary investigation. Luckily for Simeon, I had carefully orchestrated alibis for almost every single murder I had committed, enough to convincingly prove he wasn't the killer. Not that it matters. I'm still going to keep killing. Let those police buddies of mine feel the pressure. Let them scramble, trying to prove just how incompetent, brain-dead, and utterly useless they truly are. Simeon's successor, Benjamin, was a friend of mine. We had joined the force only a week apart, and had formed a bond over the years, a friendship that extended beyond the confines of work. I was proud of Benjamin in a way, but I also pitied him. I wouldn't call him naive or lightheaded, but he believed in people far too much. Take me, for example. He's supposed to be the one hunting down the killer that the department has been after for years now. But who's going to stop the killer? Who's going to stop me? What a loser. He doesn't realize that while everyone else sees him as a man of great leadership and irresistible charisma, I know the truth. He's nothing more than a thick-headed, pathetic dumbass who might as well lick my goddamn boots. Simeon, Benjamin, and I were the last few people remaining at the meal. Both Benjamin's and my shifts were over, while the rest of the team either needed to head home to finish paperwork or were stuck on night duty. As Simeon went to the cashier to pay for the meal, Benjamin and I waited for him outside with cigarettes. After a few minutes of silence, Benjamin broke it with a conversation. I found something interesting the other day. Go on. You know that app we recently took down? The Rebels program? He started. The one that literally shared a step-by-step guide on making live bombs? Oh, I remember that. Well, you know me. I've been interested in obscure apps ever since. I've started hunting down all sorts of weird ones, like those immoral or downright fake ones that spread misinformation. Like ghost hunting apps? Yeah, exactly. So, I wanted to ask you for a favor. Can you keep an eye out for obscure apps that are clearly scams or bait for kids? Let me know if you find any. Some of these apps are turning their utilities into paid content, making the scams look more legitimate. To make it seem like their nonsense is real by asking kids to pay for it, I said, taking a drag from my cigarette. Exactly. I'm planning to start a campaign to take those apps down. Are you interested? I definitely am. Alright, just send me the names when you find them. That was the last thing he said before heading off. Ghost apps? Seriously? Give me a break. I don't believe in that nonsense about spirits or phantoms. There's nothing after death, you just stop existing. All those ridiculous theories about ghosts in places like Edinburgh or the Tower of London? Pure urban legend nonsense. As I grabbed a taxi home, I decided, for once, to be a good citizen and contribute to society by helping Benjamin get rid of those idiotic apps. When the taxi dropped me off, I waited until it was out of sight before entering my house and locking the door. The best thing about my home was the soundproofing. The noises from the basement were almost impossible to hear. From the hum of the boilers to the occasional screams, everything was muffled. But I always had to stay careful. I opened the basement door and heard no screams. Perhaps he was already dead. I couldn't let that happen. I hadn't had my fun yet. I didn't want him to just drop dead. I wanted to be the one to kill him, or at least watch him die. Back in college, I was part of the drama club. I remember the day my acting skills first worked to my advantage, and I plan to use them again now. A few days ago, when I came to the school as a guest lecturer to teach kids about the dangers of trusting strangers, there was a boy named Jeremy, a smug little know-it-all. He was a student just yesterday. Now, he was a trophy ready to be put on display, a reminder for people to stop trusting the police. 1. Because they're pathetically incompetent. And 2. Because the killer is the cop. When I approached, he was leaning weakly against the wall, his wide, terrified eyes locking onto mine. Despite his condition, he still had enough strength left, enough strength to fear me, and enough strength to satisfy me. I slipped on my gloves and started throttling him. His little eyes widened with fear, pain, and despair. Maybe he'd forgotten that I was his abductor. Maybe, seeing me in my police uniform, he thought I'd come to save him instead of strangle him. I don't know what he thought, and I don't care. I liked it. The boy thrashed violently, desperate to survive. At first, it took effort to keep my grip on his neck. But soon, his struggles began to weaken. Eventually, there was no sign of life left in him. His body went limp, like a doll. That's when I stopped. I grinned. Another body added to my kill count, the youngest so far. Am I a monster? Yes. Am I proud of it? Absolutely. I stretched, letting my muscles relax as I stared at the boy's lifeless body. Then I stuffed his corpse into a golf bag, making sure to leave no trace of DNA behind. I planned to dump him in the river, bag and all. I changed into workout clothes, just in case anyone got suspicious of me carrying the bag. To complete the look, I brought along a tennis racket. If anyone saw me, they'd think I was heading to a late-night tennis session. Luckily, I didn't encounter anyone on my way to the lake. The area was deserted. At the water's edge, I pulled the boy's body from the bag. I'd been careful to remove any tape or rope marks from him. Then, with a final heave, I threw him into his watery grave. It was done. Time to go home. By the time I finished showering, it was 11 p.m. I usually went to bed at midnight, so I had an hour to kill. I turned on my computer and typed "weird apps" into the search bar, then hit enter. Scrolling through various sites like Reddit and YouTube, I came across apps that were weird but not exactly unethical. Still, I started downloading a few that hadn't been removed from the App Store. Most of them were misogynistic, to say the least. There was Girlfriend Manager, an app designed for making notes and stalking people, and Hook, which offered contacts for street prostitutes. As I kept scrolling, I came across a link titled Top 10 Weirdest Apps. Without hesitation, I clicked on it. While the website gave information to apps that I have already encountered, I stumbled on something that I never encountered or have thought of seeing. The Death app. This app is said to give information about recent deaths nearby the area. Traits of this app include giving information of the deceased, the location of their deaths, and where they are buried. An interesting gag, I thought. When I checked for that in the App Store, it was there. The app's logo, downloadable for free, was a simple white crucifix set against a pitch-black background. In the main shop, its name was displayed in bold letters, Death App, created by a company ominously calling themselves River Styx. No other apps were associated with this developer, just this one. The app had been updated 3 days ago, with the changelog noting only bug fixes. Intrigued, I downloaded it to see what kind of nonsense it might offer. It consumed a hefty 3 gigabytes of my phone's storage, not that I cared. To my surprise, the app installed successfully and appeared on my home screen. I tapped on the crucifix icon. The screen was instantly filled with an eerie illustration of a cemetery shrouded in darkness. In the foreground, the app's title loomed large, Death App. Moments later, the main interface loaded, revealing several options and filters. On the left-hand side, a menu offered categories such as by time of death, by place of death, and by cause of death. My curiosity got the better of me, and I selected the by cause of death filter. A series of icons appeared, each representing different causes: drowning, burning, falling, old age, disease, and murder. As soon as I activated the cause of death filter, the map on the screen filled with colorful squares, each marking the location of a death. The color of the square corresponded to the cause: red for murder, blue for illness, yellow for traffic accidents, and so on. Then I saw it, and almost dropped my phone. My house was covered in red squares. Murder. It wasn't a glitch either. The rest of the map showed different patterns. Hospitals covered in blue squares for illness, roads dotted with yellow for traffic accidents. Every death had a place and a story. I zoomed in on my house. At least 9 red squares clustered around it. My stomach churned as I stared at the screen. Finally, I turned off the app and headed down to the basement. There, on the wall where I kept my tally, the truth was written in black and white. There were 8 in the tally, 8 deaths recorded. And there should have been one more I hadn't yet accounted for: Jeremy. The app knew exactly how many people had died in my house. Exactly how many I had killed. What the hell did? No. Despite feeling unsettled, I headed to my bedroom, fatigue finally catching up to me. I turned off my phone and lay down on my bed, preparing for tomorrow. But as I tried to fall asleep, I realized I had been lying there, wide awake. Was it because I had killed a child? No. Was it because I had killed someone? Still no. It was the app. The app knew how many people had died in my house. It knew what I did. But how? Was it just a coincidence? A glitch? A bug? I couldn't shake the thought. And then, absurdly, my mind went to conspiracy theories, the kind I would usually dismiss as nonsense. Could this app have been made by the Illuminati or some shadowy organization to monitor people and control the population? I don't know how long I obsessed over these thoughts, but when I opened my eyes, it was morning. Maybe my mind wasn't restless enough to keep me awake after all. I started my day with a small breakfast, and then got to work cleaning the basement. I had resolved to be more cautious, leaving no trace of struggle or blood. As I opened the door to the basement, the smell hit me. The bodies I had hidden were starting to reek of rotting flesh. The stench was overwhelming. Strong enough to reach the top of the stairs, I grabbed 3 or 4 candles from my shed, the ones I'd kept for emergencies, and lit them to mask the smell. Just as I was setting them up, a notification popped up on my phone. There were 2 alerts. One was from Benjamin, saying the chief wanted all units to help find Jeremy. The other was from the Death app. The app has been successfully updated. For some reason, curiosity got the better of me. What kind of update was it? Bug fixes? A UI change? I couldn't help myself and opened the app. A notification about the update appeared immediately. Update 2.0, new features, timeline, track where the bodies are after death, minor bug fixes. The developers had even included a step-by-step guide on how to use the new feature. I scrolled through the app, navigating to the map. My eyes caught something odd, a single marker at a cemetery. It was marked old age, despite this app supposedly only showing recent deaths. How recent was recent, exactly? When I pressed the square, I saw something that made my entire body freeze with fear. It was literally displaying the timeline of where the corpse had been before its current location. You know how Google Maps tracks where you've been and when, if you enable location sharing. Yeah. Like that. When the tutorial for using this new feature ended, I noticed a red square on the lake, the exact place where I had dumped the body. Hesitant, I pressed the square to check the location of the corpse, and the thing I feared most appeared right in front of me. It showed that the corpse had come from my house, that it had died at my house, that it was murdered at my house. While some might think this is just a sick joke meant to make people look like killers, any rational person, especially the police, would immediately sense that something was off, even if they didn't believe a single thing about the app. The bus intercom announced my arrival at the station. I calmed my thoughts and stepped off the bus. Multiple colleagues were arriving in various ways: taxis, cars, and even some from the same bus I had taken. I just hoped none of them noticed me nervously fiddling with the app. At least 9 people, including me, headed into the forest where I had dumped the body. Believing in any possibility to shift suspicion away from myself, this was my chance to distance myself from the crime. By luring them to the lake and pretending it was my first time at the location, I could play the role of a hardworking policeman who had stumbled upon the body for the victim's family, not the killer. I just needed to waste enough time to make my discovery look like a coincidence. As we trekked into the forest, we decided to split up into smaller groups to cover multiple areas. This was the moment I knew luck was on my side. I was assigned to search alone near the location where I had hidden the body. With enough time to ensure there was no evidence left behind, I would report the body on my terms. When I reached the lake, I scanned the area for any signs of being caught, traces of my previous visit or incriminating evidence. Then, I checked under the lake to confirm the body was still there. It was. The bag containing the corpse remained submerged. But now, a new question gnawed at my mind. How did the app know I killed the boy at my house and dumped him in the lake? As these thoughts haunted me, I saw Benjamin approach the lake from a different angle. That was when he dropped the bombshell. "Hey, buddy. Are you familiar with a strange app? I downloaded it today after seeing it online. Something tells me there's a corpse in this lake. I think the app's called Death. Wondering if it's some kind of scam or not." He couldn't be serious. He just casually revealed he'd downloaded the app and was one step closer to finding the body. If he discovered it, he would know the app wasn't a hoax. Worse, the new update showing the death locations of murder victims and the path their bodies had traveled would expose me as the boy's killer. He knew where I lived. The body came from my house. Luckily, I had anticipated this and already devised a solution. A way to stop him from finding the body. Real? I checked the lake, and there's nothing here. Maybe the app's just another hoax, I said, feigning nonchalance. Benjamin seemed to believe my lie. Why wouldn't he? He didn't know I was a killer. To him, I was just another cop, here to search for a corpse, not to hide one. Before he could respond, I sealed the deal by transmitting a message to the rest of the team. Lake is secure. No sign of the body. Benjamin looked confused. Soon, though, his confusion began to morph into suspicion. He was starting to sense I was hiding something. Which, of course, I was. I quickly scanned the area for a distraction and spotted a small warehouse in the middle of the forest. "Have you checked there?" I asked. "No." Without a word, we both knew we had to investigate. I led the way, quickening my pace. Luckily, Benjamin wasn't keeping up. As I neared the warehouse, I mentally checked my gear: a police jacket covering my uniform, black pants, gloves to conceal my fingerprints, and a police hat. Using my gun was out of the question. It would alert everyone. So, I opted for a quieter method, something I had prepared in case I was ever disarmed. I entered the warehouse ahead of Benjamin, positioning myself against the wall beside the entrance. The moment he stepped inside, I sprang into action, covering his mouth. Even as a cop, an ambush like this was unexpected and fatal. Cops die in the line of duty all the time, whether by direct attack or unseen threats. But for Benjamin, his killer being me was likely the last thing he expected. I made sure to target areas where the wounds would be most lethal. Despite being twice my size, he collapsed without much resistance. A few more stabs, just a few more, before someone came in, but then I froze. My hand began to shake, not from fear or remorse, but from a sudden cramp. I dropped the knife and stared at Benjamin's body. He had stopped breathing. When I checked for a pulse, there was nothing. This was the first time I had killed a fellow cop. I dragged Benjamin's corpse to the back of the house, his face pressed against the floor, as blood flowed from his back. I couldn't let the blood spill onto the warehouse. After placing him in a not-so-discreet yet sufficiently hidden location, I took out his phone, unlocked it with his fingerprints, and saw it, the death app. I immediately deleted the app from Benjamin's phone and crushed it for good measure before sending a DM to the rest of the group. Nothing in the surrounding area. I will return home until further notice. I ditched Benjamin's phone and body and walked away. As I confirmed there was no evidence linking me to the murder, I smirked. This was an achievement. I had killed a cop. Who was going to stop me now? I feigned ignorance, ready to act shocked once Benjamin's body was found. Leaving the scene of the crime, I hoped nothing would go wrong. That's when my phone buzzed with a notification. Was it an email? A response to my DM in the police chat room? No, it wasn't either of those, though I hoped it was. It was a notification from the app. And it wasn't about an update, alert, someone just died near your area. Cause, murder. The accuracy of the notification was unsettling. This wasn't a hoax app or a coincidence. Someone had died, murdered. I knew that for a fact because I was the killer. The app didn't know who the killer was, but it knew Benjamin had been murdered. My blood ran hot and cold at the same time. This app, this goddamned app, knew every single death in the area. It knew exactly when, where, and how people died. A red square marking the forest showed more details. The murder had occurred just minutes ago. It felt as if the app was mocking me, reminding me that I couldn't escape justice. That someone, or something, was always watching. I wondered who they were. Who were the app's creators? I immediately searched through the credits or acknowledgments section of the app, desperate to find a name. There it was, River Styx. Who were these people? The name alone sounded ominous, as if they knew everything I had done and could soon end my spree. I couldn't let that happen. The app knew Benjamin had been murdered, even though the police, my so-called allies, had no idea it was me. As I waited for the bus, I decided to search the name on Google. I started without adding the word company and found results about Greek mythology. According to myth, the river Styx was the boundary between the land of the living and the dead. When I added company at the end of the name, I finally found something, a website. As soon as I opened it, I was greeted by their welcoming message and the confirmation that they were the creators of the Death app. The strange thing was that there was no other information besides the fact that they made the app. No purpose, no referral. I then went back to Google and visited Google Maps, hoping to find an HQ nearby that I could visit for my other purpose. I did manage to find the address of the HQ. The nearest police station to the River Styx was 10 minutes away, which meant I had just enough time. I returned home and started packing weapons into the back of my car, the one I usually use for grocery runs. Instead of heading to the shops for food, I was heading to the company for blood. I knew I had to do something to delete this app, even if it meant using force. As the morning commute filled the streets of Philadelphia, the Death app began to ring more violently. as multiple deaths had been announced while I was passing by a hospital. This goddamn app. I passed by the exact location of the company building while finding a place to park my car. It was a one-story building the size of a basketball court. The word "Sticks" was written on the door. I was at the right place. I entered the parking garage and took the handgun and a small SMG from the trunk, hid them discreetly, and headed in for the deal. The door was open, and multiple people looked at me. A policeman entered the building, confused, probably thinking I was here for someone's arrest. He never expected I came to kill them all. I opened fire on the workers. One by one, those who were on computers, doing coding, and those coming out after a meeting. I started spraying the gun in every direction, ensuring everyone died. The first round of bullets managed to kill 3 employees. The survivors looked at me in confusion, but I didn't care. I continued the massacre, firing at everyone. All hell broke loose. Some employees ran out, while others hid, but I continued the killing. That was until someone from behind me kicked me into the walls. Not only did it make me lose my balance, but whoever kicked me was incredibly powerful. The impact of the kick created a hole in the wall, and I lay there, numb. I'm a policeman with decent physical ability, but someone just kicked me so hard I was literally thrown into the wall. Just as I was trying to regain my senses, I felt something cover my hand, a sound I'd heard too many times before: handcuffs. One of the employees, I don't know who, literally handcuffed me and tied me to the table legs. When I looked at the man, trying to yell at him, I stopped. He had a face that didn't look human at all, something that seemed like it just crawled out of the bowels of hell. It didn't even feel like I was seeing a human. Yet, the other people around me seemed completely laid back, as if this was no problem, while they were literally surrounding what I could only describe as a demon. That's when I saw the figure's clothes, a robe with the word "Sticks" on it. "What are you guys?" The figure took off his robe, and that's when I felt more dread. This face, this figure, despite looking non-human, at least had human facial features that made me recognize him instantly. Simeon? Simeon stared at me with a cold glare and gestured for all his workers to leave the mess. It was just me, his old friend, and him. "Who are you?" "Are you?" "I am Simeon," the figure said. "Or at least what you think I am." What the hell was this guy talking about? Then, what are you, then? That was my next question. Death. I looked at Simeon. What did this asshole just say? Did he just say he is? You look confused, puzzled by what I said, Simeon continued. But it's exactly what you think, or maybe the opposite of what you think. I'm not talking about an alias or a nickname. I'm telling you exactly who I am, who we are. As soon as I heard, we, the employees I shot, who had been lying on the floor while I was numb, stood up, unscathed. It was as if the bullets didn't even hit them. But I swear I shot each one in the head. Do you know what I hate the most, buddy? Simeon went to my eye level and said, "It's when I have to reap the souls of people who die without any wrongdoing to their name. People, kids you killed, are prime examples. Every day I reap the soul of a child ruins my entire fucking day." Simeon grabbed my throat and forced me to stand up. I managed to spit out a word to prove him wrong. How long have you been reaping souls, you sick freak?" "Since the beginning of time." "Then you must have killed millions." "I haven't killed millions." "And you dare lecture me?" Simeon started to laugh. "Right, what's the difference between killing for the greater good and killing for laughter, old friend? Even a damn baby knows that the result justifies the means. I kill for the law, and you kill for yourself. You told me when we were cops that the motive of a killer makes them more despicable than others." Simeon grabbed me and placed me closer to him, his eyes glowing red. A human cannot play something that makes the natural order natural. "You killers are better off gone from our job and gone from this society," this human society you try to ruin. Ruining this society ruins the natural order. You are sickening to think that you are more noble than I am. That was when I heard the sirens outside, and Simeon smiled. When I drag your soul down to the bowels of hell, I will be very satisfied. The next story? The same face. I first met Dr. Marcus Chin on a rainy Tuesday in October. Like most people who seek therapy, I was going through a rough patch, nothing too serious, just the usual mix of work stress and relationship issues that pile up until you can't see over them anymore. His office sat on the third floor of a brick medical building in downtown Seattle, with large windows that looked out over the constant drizzle and gray skies. Looking back, I should have noticed something was off about him from the start. The way his smile never quite reached his eyes. The slight delay before he responded to his own name. But when you're desperate for help, you tend to ignore the warning signs. The first few sessions went well enough. Dr. Chin had this way of making everything seem fixable, manageable. He'd lean forward in his leather chair, nod at just the right moments, and offer what seemed like perfectly reasonable advice. Quit my job. Cut ties with my family. Move to a new city. Start fresh. It wasn't until I'd followed through on most of his suggestions that I realized how isolated I'd become. My savings were dwindling, my friends had stopped calling, and my family's numbers were all blocked on his recommendation, of course. That's when his advice started getting stranger. He suggested I change my name, delete my social media presence, even alter my appearance. Sometimes we need to become someone else to find ourselves, he'd say, that not quite right smile playing across his face. I stopped seeing him after 6 months. Moved to Portland, found a new therapist, Dr. Sarah Williams. The first session went fine until I noticed something about the way she held her pen, pinched between her thumb and forefinger just like Dr. Chin. By the third session, her face had started to change. Subtle at first, the angle of her jaw, the spacing of her eyes. By the end of the hour, I was sitting across from Dr. Chin again, same empty smile, same carefully measured words. I ran. Changed cities again. Phoenix. Denver. Chicago. Each time, I'd find a new therapist. Carefully vetted, excellent reviews. Male, female, young, old, it didn't matter. By the third session, they'd all become him. Their faces would shift like melting wax, their voices modulating mid-sentence until they matched his precise, measured tone. I haven't slept properly in 3 years. I've stopped seeing therapists altogether, but sometimes I'll catch glimpses of him. In the rearview mirror of my car, he's the passenger in the back seat, gone when I turn around. In store windows, his reflection walks beside mine. In crowds, his face appears on strangers who turn to watch me pass. Last week, I finally broke down and called my mother the first time in 2 years. When she answered, her voice was different, measured, precise. "It's time to come back to therapy," she said, melting to Dr. Chen's voice. "You can't run forever. I'm writing this from a motel room in some small town in Montana. The clerk at the front desk looked normal when I checked in an hour ago, but I can hear footsteps outside my door now. Someone's key is scratching at the lock. I know who it is. I know what face I'll see when that door opens. I'm writing this so anyone knows. Be aware of Dr. Chin. After all, every face is his face now." The next story. I once knew a man who was afraid of nothing. No monstrosity man-made nor fictitious could subdue his spirits, and the mere mention of the word supernatural would elicit a most cynical example of laughter. This bravery was both his greatest strength and his most profound weakness, for ignorance and heedlessness can often be mistaken for a deep and foolhardy sense of courage. He was to learn the limits of his bravery down in those oppressive tunnels, deep below the streets of Amsterdam. His name was Henke, due mainly to his Finnish ancestry on his father's side, and although his parents had passed away at an early age, it was clear that he believed his courageous convictions could be attributed to his father's character. I had met Hinkie 4 years earlier while traveling with some friends on a rather common rites of passage, backpacking through Europe during a university break. He and a few of his friends were on a similar trip and happened to be staying at the same youth hostel as myself and my companions in Rome. We all got on well, but both Hinkie and I struck up an immediate rapport with one another as he was a keen musician and I was at the time still filled with the self-promise, or should I say delusion, of stardom through my own musical pursuits. This friendship continued onwards and we maintained it via email, swapping musical discoveries, talking about politics, and generally getting to know one another as best two people can through simple correspondence. I grew to enjoy our friendly debates over the years and on a few occasions we even visited one another. Hinkie moved around a lot and as such it gave me a good excuse to visit a number of mainland European countries, not to mention that he always knew which local pubs served the best beer and which restaurants were to be best avoided. Last year I visited Hinkie in Amsterdam. The Dutch city seemed to be a good fit for him as he always liked to live in the liveliest of places, and with countless meandering canals, bridges, and walkways swamped with millions of tourists every year, Amsterdam, for Hinkie, felt like the very embodiment of life and vibrancy. At the time he had been recently hired to carry out some important maintenance work on the Rijksmuseum, which is one of Amsterdam's most impressive buildings, and this seemed to have rooted him to the one place for longer than was usual. When I met him in a small darkened corner of a local pub, well away from the burgeoning tourist trade, I was shocked at his appearance. Here was a friend I had grown to know as being larger than life, exuding bravado, and yet I was presented with a shell of a man, slight in stature and racked with self-doubt. He proceeded to impart on me the circumstances which resulted in his precarious condition, of which I will relate to you now. Hinkie had been working as a civil engineer for some time and relished the challenge of renovating and maintaining the Rijksmuseum, a building with such a long and compelling history. The museum houses Amsterdam's finest collection of historical relics, and being given access to some of its more hidden places which are inaccessible to the general public, piqued Hinkie's fascination for the obscured and unique. He had been hired most specifically to lead a maintenance crew which had been assigned to assess and repair the building's foundations. This oldest part of the structure dated back centuries and had a most bizarre and, it must be said, quite horrific history. The Rijksmuseum itself had been constructed in 1885, but what it had been built upon possessed a much older and interesting history. In the bowels of the building, under its marble floors and deep red brickwork, lay a labyrinth of abandoned tunnels which at one time served as part of the old city's sewer network. They had long been disused and fallen into disrepair, but they were nonetheless an essential part of the building's foundations and had to be assessed and repaired, otherwise the entire structure would be in danger of subsiding. The ground and upper levels of the museum were beautiful and displayed many wonderful historical relics from all over the world. So welcoming and warm was the atmosphere of the building that it was difficult to imagine the darkness which festered below. After some quick words with the building manager, Hinkie proceeded to an old, seldom used room at the back of the museum which housed a rather antiquated, creaking, and cage-like elevator which was being used to access the lower levels and sewers underneath. Pulling on a pair of dirt-covered yellow overalls, complete with hard hat and headlamp, Hinkie entered the elevator for his first descent. On his trip downwards towards the abandoned sewers, Hinkie thought to himself that those of a nervous disposition may let such a dank and isolated place prey on their minds. This may have explained why the previous man in charge of the repairs had left so abruptly, citing nervous exhaustion and refusing to ever so much as set foot in those pitch-black corridors of cold stone ever again. The elevator winch and engine stuttered as it lowered Hinkie down 4 levels into the basement. With each passing floor he observed a slight dimming of the lights, and each subterranean level appeared more sparse and stone-like than the one before. A rusted plate attached to the elevator betrayed its age. It struck Henke that the year of its construction, 1932, must have been amongst the last periods of maintenance carried out there before the persecution of the Jewish people and the outbreak of war in Europe. Henke knew much of the shameful history of the region as he was part Jewish and his great-grandfather had died during the Holocaust. Many had fled to Amsterdam for sanctuary from the Nazi regime in the early 1930s, but the long blighting arm of Hitler's horrific final solution eventually reached the borders of Holland, sweeping many thousands away to those shameful and barbaric concentration camps. The elevator shuddered to a halt, and after forcing the rusted sliding door aside, Henke disembarked. The tunnels comprising Amsterdam's disused sewer network were curious in construction and steeped in a history which stretched back much farther into the distant past than that of the museum itself. Having spoken to his employers, Henke had been specifically told to pay heed to the assessment and repair crew's knowledge of the tunnel layout, as the place could be disorientating and as the lighting system required to illuminate repair work had not been fully installed yet, that he would find it all too easy to get lost. Most importantly, Henke was informed that the two-way radios normally used to communicate between team members had been playing up, and that they were very unreliable due to interference, probably produced by nearby metallic deposits in the ground. This meant that communication between his team members would have to be carried out verbally, or by using the light from their torches to convey simple messages via Morse code. This was particularly useful in the longer tunnels. In any case, it struck Henke that the catacombs below really were isolated, lonely places. Care must be taken. Henke was greeted by Jones, his second in command. Jones was a substantially stout fellow and was rather humorous in nature. He debriefed Henke on the current progress being made by his new team, informing him that the initial mapping and assessments of the tunnels had gone well. All in all, there were 16 four-man crews, each of which would be assigned a section of the sewers to repair. Henke would supervise 2 of the crews which were working in one of the more isolated tunnels. After walking for 15 minutes, Henke arrived at the area which would be his workplace for the next few months. The sound of occasional drilling could be heard in the distance as the workers continued to install the still non-operational lighting system. As Henke's men would be working further away from the other crews, it seemed logical, although not desirable, that they would have a lighting system installed last. Each passageway seemed oddly shaped, with no 2 tunnels being quite alike. This entire section of the sewer was in fact so antiquated that it had been built long before the careful planning of such constructions had become commonplace. One tunnel would arch onwards for over several hundred meters in a strange semicircle, while others bisected it at right angles, carrying on in a regimented straight line into the darkness. Henke even found a passageway which seemed to dip and rise only to slither its way along in an unnatural S-shape. Some tunnels seemed to go on forever, others stopped abruptly as if the original builders had been unable to complete their work, leaving in a hurry. Jones tried to keep the conversation light, and with his experience of walking through the tunnels for the past 2 months, Henke was glad to have a guide to show him the way. Waiting in a large alcove were 4 of Henke's team. They would work this section of the tunnels during the day, while the other shift would take over later, working through the night. Jones introduced each of them. They seemed nice enough, but Henke was surprised to find the men largely in the grips of silence. In his experience, humor was normally found in abundance, with repair crews using it to slice through the monotony of working in such cramped and repetitive conditions. Here, though, he found them uttering not one word. Sitting in silence in that imposing alcove, removed from any consideration of camaraderie or fellowship, the only inference that they were not a collection of subterranean statues was the occasional movement of their headlamps altering the shadows around them. They seemed wholly disconnected from, not just each other, but the very environment in which they worked. Henke brushed this feeling of unease aside and committed himself to cultivating conversation. If these men were in some way angry or uncomfortable with one another, then Henke would soon lay that to rest. A happy workforce is a productive one. The first order of business was to survey the section of tunnels and decide where repairs were most pressing. Preliminary assessments had already been made, but Hinkie liked to evaluate any repair project he was involved in from the ground up. Hinkie walked the catacombs with his team and noticed immediately that they were still on edge, that they seemed frightened in an almost childlike way. No amount of questions, casual or otherwise, could elicit anything other than one-word broken replies. As they toured the numerous tunnels, lighting their way with the small torches attached to their safety helmets and taking notes about failing walls, water damage, and estimations of any possible repair time, Hinkie pressed the men on their obvious sense of fear, asking why such an experienced crew, who no doubt had worked in many tunnels before, were so apprehensive of mere bricks and mortar. They avoided the questions, looking nervously at one another and changing the topic of conversation with monotone lethargy whenever it veered towards their experiences of the old sewers, or of their previous boss's unceremonious departure from the job. It began to dawn on Hinkie that the men's verbal and physical awkwardness was not the result of tensions between workers, but rather of a deep-seated and worrying apprehension of what he did not know. What was clear was that his team seemed to be counting down the minutes until their shift ended, when they could finally clamber out of the darkness into the safety of the world above. As the beam from his headlamp trickled over the damp and crumbling brickwork of the tunnels, Hinkie again conceded to himself that some may find such a setting unnerving, but not him. Whatever had caused such trepidation and disquiet amongst the men working down there was surely a simple case of idle superstition, mischief-making, and the quite understandable psychological toll of working in a dark, cramped, and forgotten part of the world. Even Jones, who had through most of the catacombs been jovial and talkative, now adopted the same sullen expression and seriousness of disposition as the others. The passages wound and meandered their way through the ground, long steady trajectories intermittently and abruptly interrupted by sharp blind corners which made it difficult for Hinkie to identify exactly where they were. There were so many winding corridors that Hinkie felt slightly disorientated and was ready to joke with his men that if they didn't like him as a boss that they could probably leave him there, and he would never find his way out. But his men were no longer with him. He was standing at the mouth of a tunnel, and while he had continued onwards talking, trying to fill in the difficult silences, his men had stopped at the last junction. They stood motionless some 20 feet behind, staring at Hinkie with blank expressions occasionally betrayed by the slightest flicker of a very real and gripping emotion beneath, a look of suppressed terror. When he asked why the men were not following, they whispered in reply that where they stood was where the last of the repair work was needed. Pulling out a map and perusing it intently by the light of his headlamp, Hinkie surmised that he must have wandered into the most remote part of the sewer network, at the back of the catacombs. And while the tunnels continued into the foreboding distance, this must have marked the boundary of the Rijksmuseum's foundations. What confused him was that where he stood had been marked for repair. He was standing at the entrance to what appeared to be a rather innocuous tunnel, but on the wall next to the opening Hinkie could clearly see that someone had placed an identification plaque there, marking it for repair. It read Tunnel 72F, Water Damage Failing Brickwork. After double-checking his map, it was clear to Hinkie that Tunnel 72F was indeed still under the Rijksmuseum foundations and had to be appraised and repaired. But when he told his men this, they simply informed him that where they stood was as far as they would go. Anger began to take over, accompanied by frustration that the team he was supposed to be supervising were being so difficult. But even raising his voice and demanding that they head into the tunnel did not seem to move them. Just as things became heated and Hinkie began demanding that the men do as he say, Jones interjected, "We've worked down here for 2 months, Hinkie. This is a good, hard-working, talented crew you have. They will do exactly as you ask, when you ask it, but you will have to accept that for them, and me, our work stops at this junction and that none of us will go near Tunnel 72F. Whether you want to believe it or not, there is something in there." Taking a deep breath and calming himself, Hinky explained to his men that he understood the stress induced by working in such an environment for an extended period of time, but that repairs in that tunnel had to be carried out. He would talk to them later about it, but for now he would carry out the survey himself. As Hinky stepped over the threshold and into the apparently forbidden tunnel, Jones and the other men protested vehemently, shouting on Hinky to leave the passageway immediately, but he saw this as foolish. He was not to be swayed by unsubstantiated, superstitious nonsense. There was nothing in this tunnel to fear, and once more Hinky would prove to others that they should not be so scared, by stepping up, being a man, and pushing forward into places others who are more timid in nature fear to tread. It was a point of pride for Hinky. He believed in always being bold. While the tunnel seemed fairly common in its construction at first glance, as Hinky progressed deeper into the darkness it was apparent that this was unlike any sewer he had seen before. The ground was uneven, the floor dipped and rose much like some of the other tunnels, but what was peculiar was how fractured the surface felt under his feet. The ground was obscured by a thick, almost oily water which in places reached up as high as his knees. He trudged through the stagnant water slowly, not because he was scared, but simply to ensure he had a sound footing. One thing was apparent: however long the water had lay there, it was long enough to fester and produce an unpleasant, rotten stench. The walls were of a different, much older composition than most of the brickwork he had seen in the sewers elsewhere. Whatever the material was which had been used, it was hundreds of years old and was obviously failing, with long penetrating cracks scarring the surface of the increasingly unstable walls and ceiling. The light from Hinky's headlamp was enough to illuminate much of the tunnel, but as he ventured further towards what he thought was a dead end, he realized that the passageway was narrowing and that the tunnel itself did not stop there, but rather tapered slightly before curving abruptly into a blind corner. Hinky estimated that he was around 80 feet into the sewer, and while his curiosity for what could be beyond that corner urged him to move forward, he believed he had made his point to his men, and would now ask them to abandon their fears and enter the tunnel with him. He unholstered the black hand-held radio which all the workers had been issued with from his side, and began requesting for Jones and the others to meet him at the corner of the tunnel. No one responded, and nothing but a quiet buzz could be heard from the radio speaker. Of course Hinky now remembered that he had been warned about how unreliable the radios could be, but just as he was about to turn and shout on his men, something caught his eye. Surely not. There was nothing in this old tunnel but stagnant water and himself. But pushing relentlessly against Hinky's bravado and self-assured disposition was the creeping reality that something was standing at the end of the tunnel. Obscured by the turn, Hinky could only see a glimpse of it, but it was unmistakable. A ragged piece of cloth poked out from around the corner, and although Hinky's mind was unwilling to accept it, the cloth was obviously part of a sleeve which contained an arm, of whose or what's he did not know. Disbelief. Stubbornness can be an effective tonic for even the most horrifying and unbelievable of situations. Hinky's belief in himself and his long history of triumphs over adversity welled up inside of him, filling his chest with pride, and with a strong, confident stride Hinky marched towards whatever was behind that corner. The slush and slosh of the black water echoed throughout the tunnel as he made his way to that blind turn. Apprehension now turned to sadness and empathy, for standing there, shivering and disheveled, was a girl who could not have seen more than 13 years. Her face and hands were blackened with grime and dirt, hiding her pale and malnourished frame. A ripped shirt was all that she wore, hanging from her loosely with much of her body exposed to the cold of that dank, isolated place. Gazing at him between strands of dark matted hair, Hinky was struck by how beautiful the young girl was, and how afraid she must have been. At first he believed that somehow she must have made her way into the sewers and lost her way, but no matter how softly he asked her she would not answer, appearing afraid and nervous. Hinky tried his radio again, but was greeted with the same meaningless static. Regardless, he had to get her out of that tunnel, back through the sewers and into the Rijksmuseum and seen by a doctor. He did not want to shout on his men as it may have added to the girl's disquiet, so he decided to lead her out of the passage himself. As he approached, Henke spoke gently to the girl, explaining that he would take her up above to safety. She seemed terrified of him, and this made Henke feel uncomfortable, as he prided himself on being someone who would do anything to protect the vulnerable, and not at all someone to be feared. She made no sound, but as Henke neared she raised her hand, pointing one finger at the light on his helmet. He suddenly realized that the light must have been frightening her somehow, so he merely took the lamp off and held it in his hand, the torch now illuminating the girl's shirt more starkly. The changed angle of light brought something unsettling to Henke's attention. Pinned to the shirt was a yellow cloth star. It surprised him as it was entirely familiar, but it took a moment for his mind to grasp the memory. It was exactly like the yellow stars forced upon the Jewish populations during their persecution, to allow non-Jews and members of the Nazi regime to identify them. Henke's mind fought against the ramifications of such a discovery. After a momentary pause, he once again was resolute, disregarding the cloth star and asserting to himself that he must take this poor girl out of such horrible surroundings. A tremendous sense of sadness overcame Henke as he grew closer. The torch flickered unusually in his hand as he looked down at the girl, her face momentarily illuminated by the shifting light. As he prepared to carry her out of the sewers if need be. But this sense of duty, this compulsion to be brave and assertive in even the darkest of places, was now replaced with something which Henke had never felt before. Up his spine and from the very pit of his stomach fear gripped him, terror took him, and a horror so potent made him feel anxious, weak, and unsteady. For Henke had not noticed something so subtle, yet essential to his predicament. The girl had not stopped pointing at him as he drew closer. Her arm was ridged and her finger remained outstretched. Even the light which was now in his hands seemed entirely unimportant to her. Realization swept over him like a plague of abject dread. The girl was not pointing at the light, she was pointing behind him. Henke did not remember much more of what happened in that tunnel, but he knew that he had indeed turned to face whatever was standing there. He thanked God, not something he was normally inclined to do, that Jones and those men who feared that dark hollow so acutely had dispensed with this fear and ran into the passageway as soon as they heard his screams. Henke regained his composure back at the alcove where he had met the men, but he immediately pleaded with them that they take him back out of the tunnels, which is what they did. Once back in the elevator room of the Rijksmuseum, the men sat and had a frank discussion with Henke about what had been happening down there over the past few months. Jones explained that the first survey team which had encountered that specific sewer passageway resigned from their posts after just one night down there. A week later, one of their coworkers who decided to stay on committed suicide after complaining to everyone that he could hear whispers coming from that tunnel while he worked nearby. Not long after that, Jones' previous supervisor had seen someone standing at the mouth of Tunnel 72F and had followed them inside. One of the cleanup crews found him crawling out of the sewer on his hands and knees, crying hysterically like a child. He had been heavily medicated ever since, but no one knew exactly what he had seen down there. He would not talk of it. But the men who recovered him claimed he was repeating one word over and over frantically: Nazi. Henke was a nervous wreck after his experience, and ordered that no one go into Tunnel 72F. He continued to work down in the sewers, day after day in the dark, but he was consumed by the notion that he had seen something so frightening that he had forced himself to forget. Over the next few weeks he lost weight, and had trouble sleeping, often waking up in a disturbed state, drenched in a cold sweat, unable to recall what he had been dreaming about. The very idea that brave Henke could be reduced to this, that he could be affected so deeply by something he could not even remember in its entirety, preyed on his pride and his sense of self-worth. He first tried to combat this feeling of helplessness by increasing his knowledge of the tunnels. Knowledge, as they say, is power, and Hinky felt that if he knew more about that place in the dark, that he would somehow be less afraid of it. He read about the history of the museum, and while he found very little of it helpful, one local legend struck a chord with him. It was rumored that during the Second World War a number of Jewish families took refuge in the tunnels below the Rijksmuseum. When two SS officers were tipped off as to their whereabouts, they entered the tunnels with some local volunteers hoping to arrest them down there and most probably send them off to a concentration camp. The rumors were that the families ambushed the SS officers and their Nazi sympathizers, killing them and dumping the bodies somewhere in the sewers. This was the story Hinky related to me. It was sad to see him so shaken and vulnerable, a strong, powerful individual who had never shown so much as a hint of fear for, or of, anything, to be reduced to a diminished man living on his nerves. Unfortunately, the story does not end there. Some men are haunted both by what they have seen and by what they cannot understand. Ego can be a terrible burden on anyone. Once it is fractured or damaged, the lasting effects can be devastating. Hinky could not let go of his pride, nor his desire to feel strong again. Whole. He had never been afraid of anything before, and no matter what was in that tunnel, no matter how much I attempted to dissuade him, he was determined to confront it and reclaim his self-worth. 3 days later, Hinky's body was found at the mouth of Tunnel 72F, stuffed into an old duffel bag. It was a heart attack which had killed him, but whoever broke, twisted, and shoved his body into that morbid sack after he died was never caught. I should mention that the bag was of particular interest to the police in case it could reveal something about Hinky's death. It was traced to Germany, Army issue to be precise, and hadn't been manufactured since 1941. The end. Thanks for listening. The next story. The Melancholy of Herbert Solomon. On several occasions my interest in the supernatural has taken me to some of the most prestigious seats of learning in the entire United Kingdom. From the venerable halls of Oxford and Cambridge, to the more humble surroundings of inner-city colleges and schools, my pursuit of evidence to substantiate such claims has rarely been fruitful. However, while exploring the University of St. Andrews in Scotland, I found a rather interesting tome hidden away in a dark and musty corner of the campus library. The book itself was unusual, its cover bound in a weathered and blackened leather which unashamedly wore the wrinkles and cracks of time. It dated back to the 16th century, and seemed to contain various descriptions and accounts of the daily lives of the people of Ettrick, a small isolated town built in the south moorlands of the country. Perusing the volume, there were a variety of entries from a number of authors spanning a 60-year period. It seemed to have been handed down from town elder to town elder over that time, and to be quite frank, most of it contained idle musings on the townsfolk and plans for a number of humble building projects and improvements. Just as I was about to conclude that the book was of little interest to me, I noticed on the inside of the back cover that someone had drawn a picture. It was elegantly depicted, but I would never have described it as a pleasing sight. In fact, my immediate reaction was one of disgust upon first viewing it. The combination of the harsh, almost angry black lines used and the stark imagery of the scene as relayed by the artist left me with a thoroughly unpleasant impression of its subject. I shuddered as I cast my eye over it in an attempt to take in the picture of what seemed to be of a man, tall with long, thin arms and legs. His face was partially obscured by one of his gaunt white hands, but what could be seen was monstrous. Prominent veins protruded from his forehead leading up to a pallid bald head. His eyes were deep set into his skull, and the surrounding wood seemed to twist and lean away from him fearfully. At first I assumed that the picture was some form of hideous graffiti, but at the bottom of the page was inscribed the date of 1578, and a rather unusual name, Herbert Solomon. Whether this was the name of the menacing figure in the drawing or of the artist, I did not know. Disturbed yet compelled by that dark woodland scene, I decided that the book required further study. I desired greatly to know who this creature was, and why someone had felt the need to capture his strange form in a drawing at the back of a book otherwise used to record the lives of the townsfolk. On closer inspection, what surprised me further was that the same image seemed to recur elsewhere in the book, but drawn by apparently different individuals. Within the book I found numerous mentions of Herbert Solomon, and it became clear quickly that he was indeed the emaciated man in the picture. He had lived in the 16th century on the outskirts of Ettrick Town. It was a small and underdeveloped place, surrounded on all sides by the thick cover of Ettrick Forest, which itself sat in the midst of a vast region of southern moorland. The town had a small parish church with one humble steeple, an inn normally used by those traveling through the unforgiving countryside, and quaint cobbled streets which wound their way around the stone cottages and town hall, according to the descriptions in the book. During the December of 1577, children began to disappear from the town. The first was a young girl by the name of Alana Sutherland. She had been playing with some friends by an old well on the outskirts of the town, but had dropped a small toy doll down it accidentally, which had caused her much distress. Unable to retrieve it, she returned home to borrow some string and an old hook in the hopes of being able to fish the doll out of the water below. She was last seen walking towards the well just as the sun set. In a panic, the townsfolk searched. They dredged the well, they combed the wheat fields, and even sent several groups of those willing into the surrounding woods. Alas, the girl was not found. A few days later, a young boy by the name of Eric Kennedy was running an errand for his grandmother. It was dark, but he had only to take some wool over to the Monroe place as way of a thanks for the grain they had provided, and they lived but only a few streets away. It was assumed that at least the center of the town would be safe, but the boy never completed his errand. He vanished, as if he were torn from existence. By the end of January, an unusually bitter winter had caused significant damage to the town and its people. Large, thick sheets of ice and snow covered each house and building. Several people died from the cold alone, and the general mood of Ettrick Town was a somber one. Despite these trying times, the townspeople were more concerned with the safety of their offspring. In total, 7 children had now disappeared without rhyme or reason. Whole families wept in despair, and the people of Ettrick began to view one another suspiciously. They knew the truth: someone was taking their children from them. By mid-February, 2 more had went missing, and accusatory glances were now being shared between every family and every member of the community. The town elder decided to act, and took upon himself the arduous task of identifying and catching the fiend. Bureaucratic discussions were had, church groups convened, and in every house, in every street, in every corner of Ettrick, one name crossed the lips of its inhabitants: Herbert Solomon. The more the name was mentioned, the more certain his guilt became. Herbert Solomon was an outsider. He lived in a small wooden cabin amongst the woods which surrounded the town, and due to his unfortunate appearance tended to avoid human contact. What his malady was no one was sure, and in the unenlightened times of 16th century Scotland, many believed that he was cursed. Modern eyes would have guessed him to be the victim of a wasting disease. He rarely ventured into town, except on a few occasions to trade for supplies, and even in those instances he covered his face with a brown tarnished hat and a gray piece of cloth, which obscured his features below 2 deep-set and darkened eyes. Several of the townsfolk told stories of Herbert Solomon. According to these accounts, he would stand on the edge of the forest watching the farmers till their land, and their children play in the fields. It was his fascination with children which left many feeling uneasy. Some of the town's children returned home from playing near the woods on a number of occasions with beautifully crafted dolls and toys. They were a present from Herbert Solomon, and being innocent children, they could not know of the dangers therein. When the children began to disappear, eyes immediately turned to the strange man living in the woods. Accusations were carried by the whispers of fearful parents, and as the whispers increased in number, so did their volume, until it was decided that Herbert Solomon must be stopped. On a cold February night, the elders of the town decreed that Solomon should be arrested immediately. Grief, anger, resentment, and fear grew to a fever pitch with this news, and every man, woman, and child set out across the fields entering into the surrounding forest in search of the child killer Herbert Solomon. Details of exactly what occurred that night are limited, but it seems as though the people of Edric Town attempted to remove Herbert from his small cabin by setting it on fire. The crowds cheered as the heat grew and the fire rose. His screams echoed throughout the woods, finally to be silenced by the flames. The townsfolk believed that justice had been done, and while the grief of the parents whom had lost their children could never be quenched, there was at least the satisfaction of knowing that the man responsible was now dead. However, over the following few days an unease descended upon the entire town. Stories began to spread of strange encounters in the streets at night, a gaunt shadowy figure prowling the cobbled stones, hiding in the darkness. Within a week numerous residents claimed to have woken up during the night to the petrifying sight of an unwelcome visitor. One account was of an elderly lady who woke to the sound of something rustling under her bed, only to nearly die of shock as a tall, thin man pulled himself out from underneath. She fainted, but not before she saw his face, a withered complexion as if ravaged by disease, his eyes blacker than night, and his hands comprised of tightly pulled skin over a bony interior. Another story consisted of a local tradesman who, while investigating a noise from his cellar, was confronted by a hideous figure, so tall and gaunt that it had to hunch over to avoid the low ceiling entirely, its sheet-white face flickering in the candlelight. The man managed to escape, but he refused to re-enter his premises. It became clear to the townspeople that the vengeful ghost of Herbert Solomon was still searching for other victims from beyond the grave. His hate and hideous form haunting the town which murdered him. With each passing day the sightings grew in intensity and number. A fog descended on the town, and the people wept and grieved as the sound of Herbert Solomon terrorized each person, night by night. He was seen wandering amongst the wheatfields, in the cellars and lofts of cottage houses, his long gaping footsteps ringing out each night through the streets of Edric Town. They had been cursed. In life Herbert Solomon had taken and murdered their children, and now in death he seemed to possess the twisted means to terrorize the entire town. Then the unthinkable happened. Another child went missing. A young orphan girl who often wandered the streets when she could not find a place to call home for the night was heard screaming for her life. The townsfolk rushed to their windows, looking out but not daring to leave the imaginary safety of their houses, paralyzed by fear. The screaming ceased quickly, and moments later, wandering aimlessly out of the fog, came the menacing figure of Herbert Solomon. He rushed down the street, his lifeless arms bashing against the houses which he passed, scraping the doors and windows with his rigid fingers, emitting an unnatural yell of anger and hatred on his way. The girl was gone, and the town grieved once more. In the preceding days the fog grew denser, and with it came the unwelcome news of 2 more children taken. One a girl whom, after having a raging argument with her family, left the house never to be seen again. The other a boy named Matthew, the son of a notable drunk, who was taken from his own bed by the hands of Solomon, while the father lay unconscious from drink. During a church service the unthinkable happened. Solomon appeared briefly in the aisles of the church, seemingly unaffected by consecrated ground. The congregation whimpered in horror and disdain as his warped, spindly form walked slowly behind a pillar and then vanished. It was indeed a show of influence. Hope was almost lost. Not even a place of worship could deny him, and he was now capable of entering any home at night and then taking whatever or whoever he wished. The town had to act, or abandon the place altogether, but there was no guarantee that the curse of Solomon would not follow. The local vicar, a man by the name of Mackenzie, was asked by the people of Ettrick to use any sacred power which was ordained to him. In an attempt to destroy or banish the spirit of Solomon, a plan was provided. The vicar and a few chosen individuals armed with torches, swords which had been blessed, and vials of holy water, would take guard over the town, waiting for the cursed figure of that child killer to show his face once more. Then they would confront him. Observing as much of the town as possible from several house windows, roofs, and strategic street corners, Mackenzie's chosen waited. They did not, however, need to wait long. That night the lonely figure of Herbert Solomon appeared through the mist, walking the streets of Edric with purpose. Yells and screams rang out as people alerted one another that Solomon had returned. Families held their children close as dark thoughts consumed the town. "Please spare my child. Take another's." Mackenzie was the first to confront him. His will was shaken by the sight of Solomon's hideous pallid face, rotten and ravaged. The gangly, spindling figure stood staring intently at the vicar through black, clouded eyes. Another man now joined, then another. Before long Herbert Solomon was surrounded. Mackenzie instructed the men to slowly close the circle, drawing their swords with one hand while brandishing flaming torches with the other. Fear gripped them, but they knew that this could be their only chance. Mackenzie threw a vial at Solomon's lumbering feet, and as he uttered a Christian psalm, another man struck out with his torch. The blow crackled as the cloth-covered arm of Solomon caught fire. Cheers rang out from the townsfolk watching from their homes above, but the man had strayed too close, providing a gap in the circle which Solomon claimed with purpose. He fled. His spindling legs and flailing arms cast spider-like shadows on the walls and cobbled streets as he passed. The townsfolk gave chase, following the pathetic figure as it negotiated each street corner, lane, and courtyard in an attempt to escape their rage. The noise alerted the town. Herbert Solomon is trying to flee. From every home across the town, people poured out of their houses carrying whatever they could as way of a makeshift weapon. They flooded the streets and ran towards the protestations, shouts and screams of Solomon's pursuers. With every turn of a cobbled street corner, Solomon was running out of places to hide. Finally, as he stumbled down the town's main street, he stopped. The townsfolk had blocked all escape routes. He was trapped. Mackenzie pushed his way to the front of the crowd, asking for quiet and calm as he approached the hunched, defeated figure of Herbert Solomon. He and his chosen few were going to rid the town of Edric of this abomination once and for all. Vial in hand, accompanied by several large, bullish men brandishing swords, Mackenzie approached slowly, reciting verses from the Bible. Through dark eyes Herbert Solomon observed the townsfolk, their faces etched with hate and thoughts of revenge, moving towards him, and then he simply turned and entered an open doorway next to him. The people gasped, and Mackenzie and his followers rushed inside after him. The house they had entered was still, and lying on the hard wooden floor of the main hallway was the pale body of a young girl. The creaking of floorboards under weight sounded above as numerous pursuers searched the house, disappointed to find nothing. Then something miraculous occurred. The little girl gasped for air. She was alive. She had little or no strength. All she could do was utter one word: below. In the cellar of the house Mackenzie found a grim and horrific scene. The floor was covered in blood, and the quite dead body of a man lay face down upon it. Chained to the walls of that dim place were the children who had been taken. They were partially drugged, malnourished, and traumatized, but they were alive. The town rejoiced with the news. Families were reunited, lives were mended. The mist of a bleak and horrible winter slowly lifted, and all seemed well. On regaining their strength, the children recounted what had befallen them. Each of them had been taken by a man called Tom Sutherland. He was the father of the first girl who had went missing, and it appeared that it was he whom had killed her. No one knew for sure, but many were aware of his bad temper, and on more than one occasion he had beaten poor Alana. Consumed by guilt and loss, Sutherland began taking children at knife point and locking them in his cellar, often drugging them with a local herb and occasionally beating them while pathetically weeping in self-pity. On the day that the children were found, Sutherland entered the cellar drunk, carrying a knife and rope. He began striking the children once more, and told them that one would die that day. He untied one of the children and pinned her to the ground with his knees. The knife hovered over her neck, but just as he was about to plunge the blade into her, someone entered the house. Sutherland grew ferocious with anger, but whoever was standing at the top of the staircase struck such fear into him that he quickly backpedaled into the cellar. Ducking under the doorway was the tall, scarred figure of Herbert Solomon. At the sight of him, and now being free, the little girl crawled quickly between Herbert's long legs. She was free, but too weak to run. She fainted before she could escape the house. Details of what happened to Tom Sutherland were muddied by the unstable, semi-conscious condition of the witnesses. But it was clear that his neck was broken, his head twisted with such force that it faced an unnatural, opposite direction. There were various accounts of subsequent glimpses of Herbert Solomon, and some of the children claimed to find beautifully crafted dolls and toys on occasion sitting at the edge of the woods, but of course this cannot be substantiated. Indeed, I would have said that the entire story could not be substantiated, if it were not for the events which I experienced several months after reading that old book, in the depths of St. Andrews University. A colleague and dear friend of mine invited me to stay at his family home for a few days in the countryside. I knew that the house was in the borders, not half an hour's drive from Ettrick, and could not miss the chance to have a closer look at the area. I had managed to persuade the powers that be to allow me to take the book from St. Andrews and show it to my friend. He had a particular interest, and not insignificant knowledge of the history of the area. I thought perhaps he could shine a light on this curious tale. His family were very kind to me, and the house and its grounds were serene in the summer sun, with his children playing in the fields having a carefree and happy time. After reading the book he told me that it was fascinating, and that he knew of a local poem which had been written in the 17th century about a man called Solomon who killed children. But he could not tell me any more. The next day we heard screams coming from nearby the house. It was my friend's little girl. We raced outside, following the cries for help over an old fence and down a steep grassy hill. We reached a winding and furious river. The girl had fallen in and was clinging to a large tree root which thrust out from the opposite embankment into the water. The root was wet, and my friend let out a scream of anguish as his daughter lost her grip, being swept downstream towards a large formation of huge sharp rocks which jutted out from beneath the surface. The river would not let go and was throwing her around with such force that it was difficult to see how she could survive. Filled with the abject terror that she could drown, we finally made it to the water's edge. As we rushed into the murky torrent, we watched helplessly as the poor little girl was about to crash into the rocks. We were too far away. Suddenly our attention was grabbed by the cracks and creaks of a tall, gaunt figure at the other side of the river, rushing out of the woods at tremendous speed on the opposite bank. With one swift motion a thin, bony hand plunged into the violent water, prevailing against the immense currents, finally pulling the young girl to safety. She was alive. Frightened, crying, but alive and unhurt, the pale-faced, emaciated figure placed the girl gently on the ground, stared at us from across the water through darkened eyes as we ourselves clambered to safety, then turned and disappeared into the woods, fading away to nothing but a memory. Even in death Herbert Solomon was the kindest and gentlest of souls. The END. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to subscribe to my channel.